everyone. Before this I made a video on the unboxing of these watercolor tubes by DOMS, and today I'll be sharing a quick review and see how it works on different kinds of papers and what is the consistency, the pigment quality and everything. We'll talk about everything in detail today in this video. So here I'm swatching these colors by the shade. This pack comes with 12 shades like lemon yellow, orange, Prussian blue, viridian hue, yellow ochre, white, cobalt blue, black, burnt sienna, chrome green light hue, mauve and carmine. So basically we get all the primary shades and all the common shades that would be required in a starter pack, and I think this set is very sufficient for a beginner to learn watercolors. So after swatching all the colors on my palette, let's move on to swatching them on a paper. So first I'm testing out these watercolors on a very normal sketchbook that we get in our local stationery shops. The one that I'm using is by Classmate, as you can already see. And at this point I realized that I committed a very basic mistake of not using a watercolor paper to swatch test these colors. But this is also a good example of how you need the correct medium to find the true potential of your art supplies. For watercolors, this is especially true because watercolors are very transparent and they use a lot of water. That's why we need a high quality paper that is absorbent and is thick enough to hold the water. So now as you can see, because the paper is so thin, the watercolors are not reacting well with the paper and it's actually looking very patchy and shabby. You can see little blobs of color getting scattered here and there, and it's not flowing the way it should. And I was also having a hard time because I was afraid if the paper would actually tear down. So just be careful and use watercolor paper. Also, while swatching these colors, what I noticed was the blues in this pack seem to be very similar in appearance. As you can see, there are two blue shades here. One is the cobalt blue and the other one is Prussian blue. And as far as the pigmentation and transparency of these watercolors are concerned, I think they're doing a pretty good job even on this paper, because I'm picking up very little quantity of paint which is diluted with water, and still they are producing very vibrant results. And even the lighter colors like lemon yellow and carmine dry out the same way as they were laid down on the paper. So far the performance is not that bad even on this paper. Now let's move on to testing the performance of these watercolors on watercolor paper, and I would really like to apologize here because I couldn't record the whole swatching process. Actually, I thought that it was recording, but later on I realized that it wasn't, so I'm really sorry for that. But let's move on. Now I'm doing a very popular technique used in watercolor painting, that is wet on wet technique. So I just drew two circles and wet them with water, and I'm using some paints to see how they interact with each other. The basic idea of the wet on wet technique is just using wet paint and see how they flow into each other and how the pigments mix up with each other on the paper to produce a new color or a new effect or a gradient. So I tested out the wet on wet technique on two circles with different colors, and I think both of them looked pretty good. Although I'm not a professional or I'm not very well versed with this technique or watercolor painting in general, but I'm also learning as I go. So I think that the pigment quality and the saturation looks really good on watercolor paper, and on wet technique they did produce some interesting results. After some basic swatching and playing around with wet and wet technique, I felt curious about the blending ability of these colors, so I chose my favorite green color and tried to see how they would blend. So far it looks pretty good, and it's very smooth on paper. When you actually see them flow, it's very satisfying. While testing out the blending, I also wanted to see how these colors would layer, so I tried to build up the color with the same shade and see if the saturation would increase and by how much. After swatching these colors on both the papers, I quickly went in and labeled them by their given name on the back so I could quickly recognize whenever I'm using this set. And now I'm testing if the paints dry out chalky or not, because with cheaper paints it's a tendency that when they dry you can see some residue of the paint or pigment on the paper, and if you rub your finger across it, it gets deposited on the fingers as well. So with this DOMS watercolor tubes, I did not see that happen, and I was really happy about that. You get a very good quality set here within a very reasonable price, and I would highly recommend this for any beginner artist who wants to learn watercolor painting. If I had to nitpick, I would say that the only downsides that I see to this whole set would be that the blues look similar, and the second one would be that it does not have a true red color. In watercolor sets we usually get shades like vermilion or scarlet or even cadmium red, but I think maybe the pigments are expensive, so they are not provided in beginner sets. Otherwise, I think these paints do a great job, and in my opinion it's a true value for money product and you can go for it.